Wicked Science Season 2 Review. Hello and welcome to my review of Season 2 of Wicked Science, the Aussie sci-fi teen show about two teenagers, Toby and Elizabeth, who became super geniuses as a result of a freak accident. I've already given a summary of what this show is about, both in a TV spotlight and in my Season 1 review, so I'm just going to get on with the show here, not least because this review is probably going to be a fair bit longer than my Season 1 review, mainly because I'm actually going to look at each episode, and there's 26 of them, so let's just get on with it. The first episode of Season 2 is called The Flies. The Season 1 finale saw Toby de-genius both Elizabeth and himself, but left open that the latter still had the information on how to turn herself back. Season 2 picks up with everything apparently as it was, only to reveal that Elizabeth has already done so, and before long things are getting out of control. This is a fun, if unremarkable, start to Season 2 that's mainly just concerned with getting back to business as usual and setting up some new characters. Dinah has gone. Yay! She's supposedly moved away, but I like to think that Elizabeth has her in a cage somewhere and occasionally pokes her with a stick. And Toby has a new gal pal in Sasha. Making her his cousin is a clever move. It gives them a pre-established relationship, but it also removes any of that weird pseudo-romantic vibe that he had with Dinah, and for obvious reasons, any of the jealousy that Elizabeth had toward that relationship. We also have brother and sister Jack and Nikki, the former of whom is almost instantly suspicious of the strange goings-on in his new school. Interestingly, Elizabeth seems to be slightly different here already. At this point, because she's still essentially the antagonist in this episode, it's difficult to tell if it's the writing or just Bridget Novell's performance. Now, as the season goes on, it becomes obvious that they are kind of writing her differently. But here, it's a little more kind of difficult to tell, like I said, because she's still kind of driving the narrative as the bad guy. But she just seems like she's having a bit more fun. She seems less angry and stressed. She doesn't even yell at Verity or Garth once. She just seems like she's having a whale of the time being the bad girl, which is an interesting change. Of course, she's still got some vulnerability where Toby's concerned. Overall, this is an enjoyable beginning to a new season. The next episode is called Sweet Dreams. When Sasha steals Elizabeth's thunder in a science project, she retaliates by making one of her nightmares come true. While this episode does make Elizabeth look even pettier than usual, now if this had been Dinah, she would have been gloating and lording it over her and deliberately provoking her. But Sasha doesn't do that. Now this is interesting because we introduced Sasha the previous episode, and because she's basically filling Dinah's position, the audience kind of sees her as the new Dinah. And it's almost like Elizabeth sees her as the new Dinah as well. And that's why she kind of overreacts. It's like she's getting in her retaliation before Sasha's even really done anything. And this is actually a good idea, because even though Sasha is the Dinah replacement, this episode really differentiates her from Dinah, because she's not acting like that. And even when Elizabeth is kind of being kind of in her face, she stands up to her, but she doesn't do it in a kind of a nasty and personal kind of way. So you like her almost instantly. It's certainly a refreshing change from Dinah, and this is actually a really fun episode. It's interesting that the writers clearly have a plan in mind for the season, and they're setting up new boy Jack as a possible antagonist very quickly, as he starts to snoop around and even tries to create some dissent in Elizabeth's ranks. And Elizabeth retaliates against Garth's attempt at rebellion by giving him tits. No, really? I mean, you'd think he'd just stay inside all day, wouldn't you? The next episode is Superfish. Desperate to impress new girl Nikki, Toby tries to turn himself into a super swimmer, with disastrous results. This is a mildly amusing episode that's mainly notable because it's one of those where it's Toby who's being selfish and irresponsible, and it kind of points up what a hypocrite he can be, given the number of times that he's lectured Elizabeth for using her abilities for personal gain. But apparently it's okay when he does it. I must admit, I'd have trouble understanding Toby sometimes. He's constantly making an idiot of himself over these thoroughly bland bimbettes, when he's got a gorgeous girl who's nuts about him, who he won't give the time of day to. And yeah, I know she's a little bit crazy, but so what? I mean, Elizabeth is not wrong about how much fun they could have together, and she's certainly a damn sight more interesting than these vanilla chicks that he goes for. Weirdo. Episode 4 is called Fever. When Elizabeth catches a cold, the virus not only has a bizarre impact on her genius flashes, but also begins to accelerate at a dangerous rate, and Toby is forced into a desperate race against time to save the life of his best frenemy. This is a really good episode, with some genuine high emotion and great character stuff for both leads. It's interesting that the episode again brings up the notion that the flashes they get are like a compulsion that they have to follow, that Toby brought up toward the end of last season. And here it amusingly forces Elizabeth to do nice things for people, even though she doesn't really want to. More interesting is Toby's suggestion that it's just tapping into a side of her that she's repressed, and he specifically brings up what she was like before the accident that initially turned her into a genius. Elizabeth dismisses her former persona as being weak, but Toby insists that not everyone thought that. It's a pretty creepy idea that what's happened to them has actually affected their personalities. But while Toby implying that he liked her shy, introverted, pre-genius self is a nice idea, you can't help but think, well, maybe you should have acted like that then, because, maybe season 1 would have been quite different. Bit hypocritical there. Elizabeth's complete faith and trust in Toby's ability and willingness to save her is quite sweet, if not terribly surprising. But Toby continues to baffle me. Like the season 1 episode where he acted to save her from being expelled, this episode again indicates that his feelings for her may run deeper than he wants to admit. But why? The idea that he liked her even before any of this stuff happened makes his attitude to her even weirder. I just don't get what's so difficult about admitting that he likes her and showing it. I mean, I thought that kind of emotional, difficulty was Elizabeth's problem. The episode ends with Elizabeth clearly crushing on him harder than ever after he's literally saved her life, and she's clearly unconvinced by his attempt to brush it off as, oh, I'd have done it for anyone. Oh, and there's a touching and funny bit between Elizabeth and Verity, where the sick Elizabeth starts to tell her how much she values her friendship, only to be interrupted, and then later, after she's cured, she denies even remembering the conversation when Verity tries to bring it up. This is a really good episode. In fact, it's one of the only episodes from either season that I actually have any real memories of whatsoever, and it's not difficult to see why. This is one of my favourites of the season and the whole show. Episode 5 is entitled A Friend in Need. Toby comes up with a way to look like anyone in a bid to get into Elizabeth's lab, only for it to be misused and get him in hot water, and Russ starts pretending to be him in order to make up for a faux pas with Nikki. This is a slightly lame episode, certainly a come down from the previous one, not least because, in all honesty, I could really give a fuck about Toby chasing after Nikki. There's still some entertaining moments, mainly from Elizabeth, who helps Toby out with a mixture of blackmail and shameless flirtation. Her glee at making him change clothes in front of her is pretty funny too. She has certainly gotten better at the flirting since season 1. She is positively vampish here. She makes this episode, despite it being a bit flat, and I am really liking her season 2 persona. She just seems to have, I'd say, more confidence, but I think it's more self-esteem than anything else. She's a lot less angry, and she's a lot more fun. That being said, I am kind of disturbed at her claiming that she loves going to the dentist. Wow, she really is nuts. Episode 6 is called The Great Dork. Toby creates a time portal in his shed and ends up unwittingly sending Russ back to the past while unleashing a caveman on the school. This is probably the weakest episode of the season so far, not least because it takes way too long to get Elizabeth involved. I was honestly kind of sitting there tapping my watch going, is Bridget even in this episode? It does get better in the second half, and it is interesting that we're on episode 6, and Elizabeth has only been the antagonist in the first 2 episodes, with Toby's experiments actually causing the trouble in 3 out of the 6 so far. Elizabeth's reaction to finding the caveman is very funny, and she continues to be generally softer and more adorably crazy than the complete nutjob she turned into in the second half of season 1. The next episode is Close Call. Toby dives in to help Elizabeth when the teachers come close to discovering her secret lab in the school, but the pair of them are so busy dodging the teachers that they're oblivious to just how close someone else is to discovering their secret. Jack. This is a really good episode, the best since the Fever one, with plenty of stuff going on for all the characters and some good tension and character stuff. Jack's ascension to antagonist continues, as by the end of the episode he's not just suspicious but downright obsessed. Elizabeth's accidental inference that she keeps pictures of Toby in her locker is both funny and kind of stalkerish, though Toby is really quite mean to her in this episode for very little reason. Aside from one snarky remark to Sasha, which she's just as snarky back again, Elizabeth is actually being nice to everybody here, so it comes across as being a bit out of line. And again, we've got another episode where not only is Elizabeth not doing anything wrong, but she again seems to be so much nicer than she was in season 1. I mean, we're in the middle of a desperate situation here, and yet she's even smirking and rolling her eyes indulgently at the silly banter between Garth and Verity, when a season ago she would have been yelling at them for that. She really has changed quite a bit. Toby, how's about cutting her some slack? Episode 8 is called Ring of Confidence. Toby creates a confidence-boosting ring intended for Nikki, only for Russ to try it, lose it, and end up on Verity's finger. This is a fun episode, if slightly all over the place in tone. It's largely a comedy episode, but then it takes a slightly darker turn toward the end. More confident Russ just becomes, well, more of Russ, though confident Verity is pretty cool, and she's still pretty nice. She makes a severe error of judgment, however, in giving Elizabeth a pretty savage assessment of her character flaws, telling Elizabeth, who of course sees herself as being super rational, that she's completely ruled by her emotions when doesn't even realize it, and that she never thinks through the consequences of her actions. Elizabeth immediately feels the need to retaliate, thus entirely proving her point. I'm not entirely sure I like the ending of this, though. Certainly at the time. Elizabeth seems a bit too cold and malicious at the end, which is not only a bit off from how she's been from most of the season, but actually kind of goes against the accurate character assessment that Verity makes. I mean, I can see her retaliating, but she's just a bit too kind of borderline evil in that last scene. That being said, I think it does kind of make sense given later episodes in this season, as maybe some of this is less about anger as it is about fear. I think she's scared that a more confident Verity would just ditch her outright, and she still doesn't really seem to have realized that Verity actually does care about her, and she still seems very reluctant, if not incapable, of opening up and admitting that she needs and likes Verity too. Episode 9 is called Misty. Elizabeth overhears Toby confessing to a fantasy of being a cowboy and endeavours to make it come true by trapping him in a Wild West VR simulation and then putting herself in it as a damsel in distress for him to rescue. Now this is a really fun episode, another of the best ones of the season, with a bit of a whoa moment near the end as Toby actually comes within a millimetre of actually kissing Elizabeth, only for them to be dragged out of the game by his friends, after which, of course, he immediately pretends nothing happened. What the hell, dude? This is another favourite of mine, and I have to admit, Bridget looks really fetching in her cowgirl outfit. Episode 10 is entitled Catch Me If You Can. Jack sets Toby up on a date with his sister purely to get him out of the way while he breaks into his shed and steals one of his inventions. Meanwhile, Elizabeth creates an invisibility device purely for the sake of being able to spy on Toby. This is an okay episode. The developing problem with Jack continues to be interesting, but the Toby and Nikki thing is rather less so. And while invisible Elizabeth messing with Toby on his date is amusing, this plot device does mean that we get rather too little of Bridget in this one for my taste. Episode 11 is Koala in the Mist. Garth lopes off with Elizabeth's shrink ray, solely to make a dessert larger because he can't afford to buy anything else, only for it to end up in Jack's hands. And soon, there's a giant koala bear in the woods next to the school. This is another really good episode with lots of surprises and laughs. Jack is now essentially becoming the primary villain of Season 2, basically threatening both Toby and Elizabeth at the end of the episode. Toby initially blames Elizabeth for the chaos, only to feel quite rightly guilty when he realizes that it was Jack all along. Elizabeth amazingly lets him off with a flirty, "Maybe you can make it up to me sometime." An offer you can't refuse, I would have said. Episode 12 is called A Day in the Life. Russ and Sasha's bickering leads to them inadvertently causing an accident in Toby's shed/lab, which results in them swapping bodies. For an episode that's pretty Elizabeth light, which usually doesn't go down well with me, because let's face it, I watched this show for Bridget Novelle, which, I like it, but that's why I watched this show in the first place. So episodes that are Elizabeth light tend not to be particular favourites of mine. But this is easily the best of those, because it's actually pretty funny and entertaining. And the actress who plays Sasha, I can't remember her name right now, sorry, is actually really good and really funny at playing dorky Russ in Sasha's body. And I'm also impressed by the creativity of the writers this season, given that the softening of Elizabeth means that she's no longer causing the problems every single episode. The next episode is Bolt from the Blue, and boy did I speak too soon. While Elizabeth has been generally a lot softer this season, if there's one thing that can bring out her dark side, it's jealousy over Toby, which erupts when Nikki asks him to the school dance. Elizabeth basically blackmails Toby into taking her instead by threatening Nikki, but the situation then gets even more out of control thanks to the interference of someone else, Jack. This is a good and pretty dark episode, and it's interesting how complex the relationships are getting at this point, particularly between Toby and Elizabeth and Nikki and Jack. Even more so now Jack knows the truth and makes it clear what he's after to Elizabeth, a partnership to make them both rich. Now again, this is really interesting, because Elizabeth has absolutely no interest in this whatsoever. Even though this is basically the worst that she behaves this season, her motivations seem to have changed massively. Season 1, she wanted fame and fortune and power, whereas this season, maybe because she feels more in control of her life as a result of kind of getting her abilities back and doing it herself as well. Because, in Season 1, even her genius abilities were something that just happened to her. They were yet another example of how not in control of her own life she was. But now she's gotten them back all on her own, and she's made that decision that this is what she wants. She no longer seems to be interested in fame and fortune and power. She mainly seems to want to be left alone. She seems to have a real love of the science. And her main kind of motivation is her feelings for Toby, rather than any kind of desire to get rich and famous. So she basically just tells Jack to, go F himself. And Toby again seems to almost kiss Elizabeth at one point, despite spending 99% of the episode telling her that he hates her. What? No wonder she's convinced that he's got feelings for her. Talk about sending mixed signals. Episode 14 is called The Weakest Link, But unfortunately, there's no cameo from Cornelia Francis. What a missed opportunity. Anyway, Jack is turning into quite the nuisance as we go into the second half of the season. When his attempt to change tack and try and be charming with Elizabeth falls about as flat as you'd expect, he plays manipulator in order to ensure Toby and his friends are all out of the way so he can again break into his shared lab, only to unleash decidedly more than he bargained for. This is another strong episode, and thankfully there seems to be no sign of the downturn that I thought Season 1 underwent at this point. Toby doesn't seem to be holding a grudge against Elizabeth for the events of last episode, but Elizabeth is definitely holding one against Jack, and even Verity doesn't seem to be very impressed with him, actually suggesting to Elizabeth in front of him that she turn him into an insect. I do like that Verity has a bit more of a backbone this season. The next episode is called Talk to the Animals. Increasingly jealous at Toby and Nikki's growing relationship, Elizabeth comes up with a way to mess with his head, literally, in a bid to make him worried enough to want to spend more time with her, only to end up affecting Sasha as well. This one was a bit of a dud for me, to be honest. While it is interesting that, unlike Season 1, where she's just angry at the world in general, almost every time Elizabeth acts out in Season 2, it's to do with Toby, this one still kind of feels like it's going over old ground without really adding anything new. And the Sasha subplot doesn't really do much for me either. This one's a bit meh. The next episode is Verity from the Black Lagoon. Garth's constant teasing leads Verity to accidentally wreck one of Elizabeth's experiments, who throws her out in a fury, not knowing that she's been infected with something that begins to rapidly rewrite her DNA. Now this is a really great fun episode. It's a terrific little mini monster movie with Verity as the monster. And it even manages to be a bit sweet and kind of revelatory in regards to the often weird friendship between Elizabeth and Verity. As badly as Elizabeth has often treated her, this episode makes it crystal clear that Verity is loyal to her, not because Elizabeth is her only friend, but because she knows that she's Elizabeth's only real friend, and that she needs her, whether she'd say it or not. And it becomes clear that Elizabeth does seem to know that on some level. And on that note, I think that the ending of this, where Elizabeth alters the security on her lab so that Verity will now always be able to get access, even if she's not there, is a really significant and telling gesture coming from her, particularly given how paranoid and security conscious she is. It's kind of actually. The next episode is The Truth Is Out There. A heated competition between Elizabeth and Sasha over the school science fair takes a back seat when Jack gets access to Elizabeth's secret lab, a truth serum, and a video camera. Now this one starts off looking like it might be a bit meh, and Sasha's sudden bitchiness to Elizabeth seems a bit random and out of nowhere. For God's sake, don't start turning into Dinah, Sash. I had enough of one of her. Though to be fair, Elizabeth seems more mildly irked by Sasha than the seething hatred that she had for Dinah. But fortunately, this episode takes a different tack to that, and then escalates into a surprisingly tense affair as Jack gets closer than ever to exposing Toby and Elizabeth's secret. It's always really fun when Toby and Elizabeth have to work together, and it's indicative of the strange relationship that they've got this season, as even though Toby remains combative with her and refuses to countenance the prospect of a relationship with her, there's still this kind of mutual trust and understanding between them nonetheless. And kind of following on from last week, Verity kind of forcing Elizabeth into admitting that she likes her is both funny and sweet. Elizabeth is so weird. You know, I'm convinced that she's kind of, what's the PC way of putting this? On the spectrum. She's just so utterly hopeless at relationships and with emotions in general. I mean, even with people that she actually clearly gives a toss about, like Toby and Verity, with the former, she's always going about things in the wrong way. And with the latter, it takes a freaking truth serum for her to be able to admit that she actually likes her best friend. I mean, you're a weird girl, Elizabeth, but I like you. The next episode is Air Dog. Still intent on exposing Toby and Elizabeth, Jack steals Toby's anti-grav device and fits it to a dog that Toby is supposed to be looking after for the principal. This one is okay. It's got a few amusing moments, though it falls a bit flat, not least because there's far too little Elizabeth for my taste. It is interesting that Jack has now gone from simply wanting to exploit Toby and Elizabeth to actually wanting to learn how they did it so he can become a genius himself. But Toby continues to insist on making life difficult for himself by actually lying to Elizabeth that everything is fine in the middle of a crisis. I mean, it's not like she could and would help or anything. You know, for a supposed genius, Toby can't half be a dumbass sometimes. The next episode is called Crazy for You. When one of Elizabeth's experiments is ruined by Verity and Garth failing to pay attention while she's absent, she creates an artificial intelligence robot to ensure that such things don't happen again. Unfortunately, said AI starts to become a little too obsessed with her. This is a real hoot of an episode. The AI manages to be genuinely creepy, even while obviously being a parody of / homage to 2001. Toby continues to frustrate the hell out of me, continuing to run around like a headless chicken over Nikki, whose interest in him seems to run hot and cold. And while he manages to save the day and rescue Elizabeth, much to her gratitude, and they have a little moment, he then completely ruins it by running off to see Nikki. For fuck's sake! But the character development that Elizabeth has undergone this season continues apace, primarily in the ever-warming relationship between her and Verity. Elizabeth actually apologizing to Verity, at first kind of casually dropping it into conversation, and then more sincerely after she's called out on it, is almost as jaw-dropping to us as it is to Verity. And Elizabeth's embarrassed awkwardness at Verity hugging her, followed by a secret little smile, is genuinely heartwarming. This is another great episode. The next episode is Time Loop. Increasingly desperate to make something happen with Toby, Elizabeth does a double whammy by not only transporting them both into a parallel universe where they're actually a couple, but into a time loop on the 6-month anniversary of their couplehood. A loop that Toby is going to stay in until he finally gets it right. This is another really fun and funny episode. Although Elizabeth is obviously doing the wrong thing, she's hilarious, and it's impossible not to feel for her anyway. Honestly, I'm starting to think she needs to give it up, though. She seems to be largely over her anger issues this season, but her fixation on Toby, while understandable in a way, is clearly not healthy or doing her any good. And whatever his feelings for you are, he's clearly not going to admit them no matter what, so maybe it's time to move on, sweetheart. There's plenty more fish in the sea. On a completely unrelated matter, my phone number is... The next episode is Underwater. Elizabeth creates a defense spray out of toxic octopus venom, only for moron Garth to lope off with it in order to play a joke on Russ, only for it to end up instead impacting not only Elizabeth, but a teacher to boot. This is an okay episode. It's mildly amusing, and it's certainly not bad, but it's fairly average in comparison, especially to the last few really, really good episodes. The next episode is Ghost Girl. The arrival of a Hollywood horror movie starlet who wants to spend time at a normal school does not impress Elizabeth, and she's particularly disgusted at the way her classmates fawn all over her. But when said starlet deliberately embarrasses her on a school outing, Elizabeth decides to teach her a lesson about what it's really like to be scared. This is a silly but fun episode. I didn't think I was going to like it much at first, but even though this is a plot that you could easily see being done in season 1, it's actually done really differently here than it would have been then. Although Elizabeth is still being rather petty, at the end of the day she's really just pulling a harmless, if fairly elaborate, practical joke. She's no intention of hurting anybody. she never lets it get out of control, and she actually seems to be having a whale of a time doing it. And I really like that her reaction to Toby kind of ruining it early is not even to get angry then, but just kind of roll her eyes at him and complain that he's a real party pooper. And you know what? She's not wrong. I mean, is it just me, or does this kind of new fun version of Elizabeth make Toby look a bit like a pious stick in the mud sometimes? No? Just me? The next episode is Spider Boy. Garth's obnoxious little cousin Rodney is in town, and when he starts causing chaos at school, Garth pulls him into Elizabeth's lab to try and keep him out of trouble, only for the little idiot to start messing around with Elizabeth's genetically enhanced spiders. This is another really fun monster movie episode. It's perhaps a little bit too similar to the Black Lagoon one and not quite as good, but it's still really entertaining with some great jumps and some big laughs. This is another really good episode. The next episode is Meet the Parents. With Toby about to meet Nicky's parents for the first time, Jack makes a deal with Elizabeth that he can ruin it and split them up in return for the secret behind their genius. Not only does Elizabeth not have any intention of honouring that, however, she decides to add her own brand of trouble to the occasion. This is a fairly lame episode, to be honest. It's probably the weakest of the whole season, partly because Meet the Parents scenarios are always cringeworthy to watch anyway, but also partly because Nicky's just a dull character. I'm sorry, she's just dull, darlings. I mean, I don't hate her like I hate Dinah, but she's just boring, and Toby's kind of boring when he's with her. I just don't care about their relationship. The most significant thing about this episode is that Elizabeth's obvious jealousy finally clues Jack into how she feels about Toby, which gives him a way to manipulate her. He is kind of right when he says at the end of the episode, "Why do you like him so much anyway? He doesn't appreciate you. Maybe you should be looking somewhere else." I mean, he's right. He's still a creepy asshole, but he's kind of right. The next episode is Jack Makes His Move. Increasingly disconsolate over Toby and Nicky and the growing realization that Toby really might never want to be with her, Elizabeth proves to be easy prey for a manipulative Jack. Initially agreeing to hang out solely in a sort of last-ditch effort to try and make Toby jealous, Elizabeth is soon sucked in by Jack's seemingly sincere attention and affection, much to Verity's horrified disbelief, and even lets him into her secret lab, where Jack finds exactly what he's looking for: the secret to how she and Toby became geniuses. The first part of the two-part finale is great stuff. It's telling how much Elizabeth is in desperate need of some positive attention and affection, and it's rather cruelly ironic that it's the way she's softened this season that makes it so easy for Jack to manipulate her. Like I've said before, in season 1, Elizabeth wanted fame and fortune and power, but all she's wanted this season is someone, preferably Toby, to share things with. Poor Elizabeth. It's impossible not to feel bad for her, surely. The next episode is Endgame, the final episode of season 2, and sadly the final episode of the whole series. Now that Jack has the secret to becoming a genius, there's just 2 more things he wants to do: engage the process, and then remove Toby and Elizabeth. This is a really strong episode. Jack comes across as being actually outright evil, utterly cold-blooded. I mean, this goes beyond him just kind of using Elizabeth in a sort of the end justifies the means sort of way. I mean, he actually relishes and delights in the fact that he's hurt and humiliated her. What a piece of crap. It is good to see, however, that while she's obviously initially devastated, Elizabeth's anger kicks back in, but in a kind of a healthy and positive manner. She uses her anger as a tool to get over her hurt and to get on with what needs to be done, which is stopping him. She doesn't allow it to consume her, as was once the case. It's a great Toby and Elizabeth episode as well. The King Kong homage with the giant koala is very fun, even if the CGI is terrible. And it's really very sweet that she finally gets to plant one on him. While he doesn't entirely reciprocate, he doesn't shove her away either, and he even gives her a kiss back on the cheek. Aww. It's perhaps telling that we don't even get to see Nikki in this episode, because frankly, fuck her. It's a shame that we didn't get a third season, but I loved season 2, and I just plain like it a lot more than season 1, and this is also a much more satisfying series finale. Now, it doesn't really seem like it was intended as a final episode. It's a very good season finale, but it doesn't seem overly conclusive other than to close the Jack arc. And it is a little bit of a shame that we don't even get to see Verity have a line in the last episode, especially since I thought her character improved a great deal in season 2. In season 1, Verity just seemed to be there for Elizabeth to yell at, and then she'd complain about getting yelled at. But in season 2, we actually saw a lot more sides to her, and we even really kind of got to explore that friendship more, which I really liked and appreciated. Now, this is a better series finale than the season 1 finale would have been. Don't get me wrong, I liked that episode as a season finale, but if that had been the end, that would have really sucked for an Elizabeth supporter like myself. Season 2 at least leaves her in a much more positive place. It even kind of gives us a little bit of a hint that maybe Toby might finally get his head out of his arse where she's concerned. And on that note, before Jack reveals what a little shit he is, does Elizabeth not actually make a pretty great girlfriend? She certainly comes across as being genuinely loving, trusting, affectionate, and sharing. And she seems to be much more emotionally available than she's ever been. And at least her final scene with Toby does indicate that Jack's betrayal is not going to undo that change in her or send her back to being ragingly angry again. It's also indicative of how far she's come, that despite what Jack's just done to her, she not only allows Toby to go and deal with him rather than seeking revenge, she then puts her own life at risk by drawing the giant koala after her and away from the rest of the school. She puts her own life at risk to protect other people, and she doesn't seem to even hesitate to do that. I mean, I'm sorry, not only is Elizabeth no longer the bad guy, she's a freaking hero in this episode. The last time that we see her, she's clearly rather shaken up and emotional after everything that's happened, but she's nonetheless left seeming happy with a smile on her face, reaffirming her feelings for Toby, and the two of them even seem to have made something of a breakthrough as well. Maybe not romantically, but Toby seems to have finally registered that maybe she has changed, probably because of her selfless and near fatal bravery. I much prefer the series leaving her like that than how she was at the end of season 1. I just love season 2. The episodes are generally stronger. There's no downturn in the second half like I thought there was in season 1. And Elizabeth, who is my favourite character by a long way, has a great character journey and is just a lot more likeable and even lovable. And what this does, of course, is that it allows Bridget Novell, who's a really, really great actress, to kind of show more sides to herself and to the character this season. Whereas in the second half of season 1, I kind of felt Elizabeth became a bit one note, which seemed like a bit of a waste, really. But that's certainly not the case in season 2. I mean, they soften her considerably, but they still kind of show that it's not easy. It's not easy to change. She still slips several times. She's still got a dark side. But they do a really good job of showcasing that she's not just that, and that she is capable of being something more than that. I loved revisiting this show for the first time in 15 years, and I'm actually really sad that there's no more now. I gave season 1 an unremarkable, if still fairly solid, B. But I pretty much adored season 2, and it's an indication of that fact that I am giving Wicked Science season 2 nothing less than a straight A.